Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, I want to talk about Gen Z's luxury poverty crisis. This is a video that was put out by Cole Hastings. He's a Gen Z YouTuber, and he talks about the economy and just sheds light on a variety of issues plaguing Gen Z at the moment. And while I have a lot of empathy for Gen Z, I think they've been caught between a rock and a hard place. I don't think they're exceptional, and I don't think continuing to play the victim card is going to help Gen Z. So I want to dive into this video, some of the things he talks about, and really try to shed some light on some of the structural problems happening within the economy, and then conclude with some recommendations of what folks can do about this. So let's dive in.
Gen Z is living in luxury poverty. Why the limited edition Dubai chocolate moonbeam ice cream Labubu flavored crumble cookie with matcha meme exists. And why Gen Z isn't growing up the way they should be. The graph I was referring to was the change in cost of various products and programs since 2000. But what do I mean when I say luxury poverty anyways? Well, the way I would define luxury poverty is a state in which someone has the buying power to splurge on meaningless consumerism without ever having enough money accumulated to make important life-changing purchases.
I would modify this slightly. You're someone who doesn't have discretionary income. So I wouldn't necessarily call it poverty. I think this is kind of clickbaity. Like, poverty means you're living in your car and you're eating cold canned, soup, and like you literally have nothing. A lot of this, the ability to spend money, whether it's on credit, buy now, pay later, or with limited discretionary means, that in and of itself is a luxury, and it's something that distinguishes people from being in true poverty and the thinking that they're in poverty. So I wouldn't necessarily categorize it as that, but it's this phenomenon where you really don't have any money. Like I said, you're either spending on credit, spending buy now, pay later, or if you have cash, like you don't really have a lot to really splurge at the end of the month. So you're spending it on, I wouldn't even say meaningless things. In this case, I would say you're spending it on a substitute for something that is above the usual, feels like a luxury, but maybe it's not. So here's a good comparison. So Millennials have been obsessed with having experiences. That has been the thing that has been marketed to us. We should go and travel and do things. So maybe you want to go to Paris. Well, okay, maybe not right now, but maybe you've dreamed of going to France. You want to go to Paris and you just want to go experience it. But obviously the cost of a flight and a hotel and then all the excursions, it's just way too much money. You don't have, $2,000-$3,000 in the bank to experience that. So what's the next best option? Well, okay, if you can't afford that, maybe you can afford a $300 fancy dinner at a 3-star Michelin restaurant at a French restaurant. Okay, well, maybe you can't afford that. So maybe the next best thing is you go and get croissants. That's what me and my fiance do. We love croissants and get those all the time. But you see what I'm saying? Like, you figure out where on the socioeconomic totem pole and the hierarchy of things, what you can afford, and then you go and get that thing and you do it often. So for me, like my luxury item when I was, in my 20s living in DC, definitely going out for coffee, going getting avocado toast, going getting takeout, going getting, food at, I would say like fast casual places. Like I couldn't afford a nice sit down meal at a really nice restaurant. So I would look for like the next best thing. And then, underneath that, like what's the next best thing from there? And so getting coffee and a pastry was always like achievable for someone who doesn't have a lot, like spending at the time like $10, on a cookie and a latte. It felt like a splurge. It felt like a luxury, but it was something I could afford. And so I think this is what he's trying to get at. I wouldn't call it poverty. And I do see what he's saying with you not having enough money accumulate to make important life-changing purchases. But I think it's like substitution spending for what you want or like the bigger things you want. Like, okay, you can't afford a nice house, so maybe you'll get a really nice sofa, for example. Like you can't afford $1 million townhome in Washington, D.C., for example, but you can afford, or like maybe a $5,000 couch from Restoration Hardware seems more like achievable. So I would say it's more of a substitution, a lower barrier to entry substitution for the thing you want but can't afford. And the lower barrier to entry substitution is good enough or sufficient enough. And I think that's an important distinction. There's a boundary between like not having discipline about spending and buying frivolous, stupid things and like trying to substitute and placate yourself because you really truly can't feel like you feel like you can't have the thing you actually want. So I do want to make that distinction between, you know, shopping on Temu all the time because you can't like control yourself and you have a shopping addiction versus like spending $500 on a cashmere sweater because like that feels more affordable than maybe a trip to Paris Fashion Week, for example.
And by the way, I didn't create this phrase. The first I heard of it was on an Art Chad video. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's dive into what's happened over these past few decades that's fueling the purchase of $8 matchas over Mainers. There are 3 industries we need to observe, starting from the 1970s, in order to understand this shift: housing, college, and consumer goods. In the 1970s, after World War II, housing construction boomed, with over 1.6 million total units under construction just before 1974. When materials no longer needed to be diverted to the war effort and birth rates were spiking, the huge demand for family homes put builders to work. 30-year fixed mortgage rates also became standard, making monthly payments affordable. And while mortgage rates were high, the cost of a house, even when adjusted for inflation, was not. College tuition at public universities was also incredibly low, often a few $100s a year thanks to heavy state funding. More on state funding later. Federal student loan programs were smaller and more targeted too, limiting debt. But consumer goods, those things were expensive and crappy. Most electronics were still being built domestically during this time, and for exorbitant prices. Computers were bulky as hell, costing thousands of dollars, and TVs were anywhere between a few hundred to over $1,000. When adjusted for inflation, that can get close to $3,000 or even $4,000 bucks. In short, housing and college, cheap, consumer goods, expensive. When we move on to the 1980s, however, this is where you're going to start to see these trends move in the opposite direction. But first, I want to talk about something that may genuinely increase your purchasing power, which is today's sponsor, Triple Ten. The job market feels absolutely cooked right now. All this talk about AI replacing jobs and the insane predictions about how many future jobs don't even exist yet can make you think why 1980s was the first recent-ish decade where things started to become unstable. Regarding housing, urban land use restrictions began tightening further, with zoning laws being enforced in residential areas, making it harder to build. Inflation was also a huge problem during this time, triggering what some refer to as the forgotten recession that irrevocably damaged the American economy. The Consumer Price Index, the measure of inflation most cited in popular discourse, reached an absurdly high growth rate of almost 15% in 1980. So what did Paul Volcker, the chair of the Federal Reserve, do? The same thing we do now when inflation gets too high. He hiked interest rates. By increasing interest rates, mortgages, car loans, and business loans all go up. When those go up, it encourages consumers to save and spend less. When fewer people and businesses are buying goods and services, companies have less ability to raise prices.
Okay, this is a really important kind of caveat here that he alludes to, and it's implied here but doesn't really dive deeper into. One thing you have to understand is we don't live in a capitalist economy anymore. Everyone likes to blame capitalism, that capitalism's ruining everything. We haven't lived in a truly capitalist economy for several generations at this point. I don't quite know when to pinpoint the shift. I would say with probably the Great Depression, around that time, with the emergence of Keynesian economics. If you're not familiar, John Maynard Keynes was an economist out of Britain, and he promoted this idea of like deficit spending and that governments could be responsible for generating demand within the economy. So that shift happened in the 1930s. You saw the government playing an increasing role in not even just like managing interest rates like we see today, but like creating jobs, which is really, in my opinion, the backbone of any economy. And so you started seeing this transition. And so from, the 30s onward, you've seen more prominence of economists, reliance on economic data, folks. Prior to, I think, I was reading in a book, I think it was Truman, I want to say, or Eisenhower, prior to the post-World War II presidents, you didn't have like Council of Economic Advisors. The president didn't have that because economists really didn't have a role to play in government. And then all of a sudden, they're arguably the most important players. Like right now, the Federal Reserve is one of the most important players in our society. Like choices that Chairman Jerome Powell are making, a man who was not elected, who owes nothing to you, knows nothing about you. He has made choices about interest rates that determines whether or not you can afford to buy a home right now. That determines all sorts of different things, right? And so over time, we've had an increase, I would say, management of the economy. So we're far from what libertarians would prefer, which is, laissez-faire, hands off, kind of let the supply and demand run its course, and everything will, always really come back to an equilibrium. We're gone from those days, and we're back in the days of having managed economies. And so in the United States, that is, I would say, technocratically managed economies. So you have experts who have been elevated in prominence and social stature, who we rely on to make choices on our behalf. And in other countries like, China, you have state-run enterprises. So the political party that's in power makes choices about how the economy runs. And in some cases, they defer to, technocratic bureaucrats. In some cases, they don't. But you've seen more and more of this. So I want to be clear about that, because I think Gen Z and everyone likes to blame capitalism, and I think Gen Z is moving towards a socialist, more towards socialism because of that, without recognizing that we don't actually live in capitalism to begin with. So you can't pin blame on a problem for something if that's not the actual structure of which we're living in.
And therefore, price growth slows. The problem is, this isn't a consequence-free solution. It usually sparks recession and unemployment, putting most of the hurt onto everyday workers. And this happened significantly starting in the 1980s. The national unemployment rate briefly reached 10.8%, higher than it got even in the Great Recession, and it didn't get back to 5% until 1989. It was even worse for minorities. The early 1980s recession also coincides with what is quoted in the article as a remarkable inflection point in the American economy. You see, in the years leading up to the 1970s, the job market was generally tight, and periods of full employment were common. But after the Volcker-era recession, the kind of labor environment where job openings exceeded available workers, forcing employers to raise wages and improve working conditions, became rare. Union membership had already dipped by about 5 percentage points between 1960 and 1980, but the downturn accelerated the decline, wiping out another 10 points between 1980 and the mid-1990s.
Okay, I want to talk about this graph, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to record commentary on this video. I think what YouTubers like Cole Hastings does, I think these videos are valuable, but one thing you have to understand is they just cut and paste all these different graphs and charts and snippets from news articles, and there's no real historical context to understand what's happening, why it's happening, etc. So he pinpoints the 1980s and Paul Volcker and those policies as to why, things happened. Negative things happen in the economy. What this graph talks about, and you've probably seen similar ones to this, is how productivity and wages decoupled. And so he's talking about the decline in union membership, which you can see here. But right here, you can see before 1980, productivity began decoupling from wages. So in this graph, productivity is a straight line, increases over time, measured by a dark blue. And then you can see hourly compensation was rising alongside productivity. And then in the mid to late 1970s, it started flatlining, and basically wages haven't caught up since then. So that's a popular talking point. I've used it before. A lot of people use it. They're like, okay, productivity, wages have decoupled. This is why we're, this explains why we're in the situation we're in today. The problem is no one has asked, why? What happened? Something happened in the 1970s, and we're just no one is talking about it. So I want to talk about it because I think this is really important. I think you have to understand what came before the 1980s to understand how and why we got to the point we're at today. And I think if young people can look back on recent history and understand structurally and fundamentally what has happened in our economy, then I think they can create a path for themselves moving forward. But until we really dissect this and understand our own recent history, it's just going to be a continuous blame game, blaming boomers, blaming capitalism, blaming the government, and no real solutions are going to come forward. So I want to switch over to my handy dandy notebook. So we need to talk about, to understand why and how productivity and wages decoupled, there's a few things we need to talk about. So The first two things is in the late 60s, America was spending a lot of money. So you had Johnson's Great Society in the mid to late 60s. There was some good stuff that came out of this, right? Like civil rights legislation came out of this, Voting Rights Act. But you also had an expansion of government-funded programs. And this was the largest expansion of government-funded programs since the 30s during the Great Depression, okay? And so like I said before, we have transitioned from capitalism into a managed economy. So you have to pay for these programs. And all of these programs usually come from taxes and tax revenue, right? So that's really important to understand that taxes are the things that usually pay for government-funded programs. At the same time, we were in war in Vietnam. So overlap, same time, spending lots of money. The United States taxpayer, we were spending a ton of money subsidizing welfare programs to create Johnson's version of a great society and the Vietnam War. I'm not here to say either was good or bad. I'm just saying what is. We had government policies that drained the coffers like none other before. Okay. So I want to jump real quick to 1971. When all this was happening, Nixon suspended the gold standard. A lot of this was due to France, and there was some history going back for that as well that I think is worth diving into in a separate video. But the French put pressure on the United States, and basically Nixon had to suspend convertibility in gold, and that put us onto a fiat currency. So we unpegged US dollars from gold. So before then, on the gold standard, if you had $1 of printed money, you had to have $1 equivalent of gold somewhere stored. Now that is no longer the case. You can print whatever you want. So fiat equals inflation. You can just print whatever you want. Okay. So what happens if, say, you have a lot of government spending and you don't have the tax revenues to cover it? You print money. Okay. So in the 1960s, you had this permissible environment where you needed money to fund all these programs, to fund war, and you didn't necessarily have it. And so the government made it possible to start printing money. And this is what we're still dealing with today. Okay. So a couple other things happened during this time. So if you're not familiar with Milton Friedman, he was an economist from the University of Chicago, and he wrote an essay in 1970 that was published in the New York Times. And this fundamentally changed the economic paradigm of the United States. So I'll get into this in a second, but he introduced shareholder value into the economy. Okay. And then the last thing that happened during this period, which I think is relevant, is we had the OPEC oil embargo. Energy runs the world, right? If you have cheap energy, you have a well-functioning economy. So suddenly when OPEC took away America's oil, the entire economy didn't have the fuel literally it needed to run. So these events kind of give you an idea of what the economic operating environment was in the late 60s and 70s that led up to what you saw in the 1980s here in this picture here with the decoupling of productivity and hourly compensation gains. Okay, so let's move on to this shareholder value because I think this is important. So I'm going to say you had, so there's pre-Milton, we have pre-Milton Friedman, and we have post-Milton Friedman, okay? So before Milton Friedman, before there was these changes in monetary policy, driven in part also, with the suspension of gold and all that kind of stuff, you just had a change in the economic philosophy of how the government and the country should be run. So before this, you had, what would have been known as stakeholder capitalism, or stakeholder, or say paternalism, right? So under this paradigm, employers were responsible for the employees. So unions had played an important role in being an arbiter and helping workers kind of collectivize their bargaining power between the corporate managers, factories, and the workers. So during this time, it was all about, consumerism, post-World War II economy, production of things, production of widgets. So we had transitioned into a production consumer economy. So the goal was to get as many widgets produced per day, per person, per hour as possible, right? And so companies adopted a stakeholder paternalist management philosophy where they wanted to give the workers what they needed so that they would work hard and produce a lot. You see this today with tech companies, right? There's a reason why you see companies like Meta and Google and like Apple, and they have catered lunches and all these benefits and nap pods and relaxation rooms and foosball tables, because they want to increase worker productivity. They're giving all of these things and these perks to their workers in order to increase productivity. So with the help of the unions, workers pre 1970 had a ton of benefits. They had good wages, good healthcare, days off, yada yada yada. Okay, well then the economic operating environment changed, and so part of that was domestic, but there were other factors as well. One of the most important factors is there was new competition from overseas producers. So post World War II, America was the lone superpower. We were the only ones producing stuff, right? But then we essentially subsidized the reconstruction of Europe and the reconstruction of Japan. So after a couple decades, they had rebuilt their manufacturing base. And because they didn't have the standard of living and the cost of living and unions and all this stuff that we had here in the United States, they could produce stuff far cheaper. So it suddenly became possible for employers in the United States to manufacture goods in, say, Japan or Germany or China or Mexico for a fraction of the cost that it costs here in the United States. So what happened is we moved into this post Milton Friedman economy where shareholders became important, and this has to do as well with this operating environment. So you had competition that was emerging, right? You had a really difficult time to make ends meet with the economy we've built for ourselves, high expenditures, limited tax base, new opportunity for inflation with the introduction of fiat currency, right? So as interest rates rose, it costs more to do business in the United States, right? And so instead of borrowing money, as had been done before under this system, right, where you would go to your mom and pop bank and you would take out a business loan and everything was kind of hyper local, we moved to an investor shareholder based economic model where businesses were going to private sources of capital to borrow, right? So instead of paying a percentage, on a loan, say, a 10% interest, you are now paying a percentage in say dividends, right? Sorry, my writing is terrible at the moment. So now all of a sudden, instead of paying back loans, you were paying dividends to shareholders. So the primacy was not on the worker, it was on the shareholder. Okay. So the operating environment changed, the economic philosophy governing businesses within the United States changed, and suddenly there were all these new international suppliers that you could start working with. You didn't have to hire American workers. And so, as you can see in this graph, productivity decoupled from wages at the same time that union membership also started to decline. So businesses didn't want to deal with unions anymore. They didn't want to pay American wages. They couldn't afford to and keep the same profit margins that they had in the 50s and 60s. So they started shipping jobs overseas. They started deindustrializing the United States. And so one of the things that is lost when people look at this chart and they just look at graphs like this is how did productivity decouple from wages? And the answer is the loss of jobs. The only way, or the primary way, in which you transmit or you transfer productivity gains to workers is through a job. And you could do that, unions obviously help. They help with negotiating power and all that kind of stuff. But jobs are the linchpin. If you do not have jobs, there is no mechanism for productivity gains to be transferred to workers. Instead, what happened and what we're seeing now is productivity gains were transferred not to the workers, but to the shareholders, right? Because those are the ones who are now accountable, who employers are now accountable to. Workers are a cost. They are on the liability side of a company's balance sheet, right? Under this system right here, the stakeholder paternalism system, workers were seen as assets. Human capital was an asset because you needed human capital to produce widgets, okay? Once we shifted to a shareholder-based economic system, you didn't need workers anymore. The goal was to get rid of and lower the cost of workers. So you saw massive offshoring of jobs overseas. And so I've actually, I'm super fascinated by this because I grew up in the shadow of this. I grew up in the Rust Belt and I saw in real time how this affected me, how this affected my families, but I wasn't consciously aware of it because we don't talk about these things. So I've made it like my personal mission to start studying this. So I actually, these are 3 books I've recently read, if you can see them, all about this. So the first one I read is The Deindustrialization of America by Bluestone and Harrison. This is a couple, I think, sociology professors, but this was written in the 80s. This book is, written in the 80s, uses data from the 60s and 70s, literally talks about the deindustrialization that almost everyone today remembers from the 2000s and then 2010s. And then this one, highly recommend reading this as well. This is about Janesville. This is about what happened when the GM plant closed in Janesville during the global financial crisis in 2008. And then this is a more recent one. This is called American Made, and this is about workers in Indiana. And this was written, when was this written, actually? She published this book in 2021, but she was doing her research for it in like 2017, 2018. So this talks about how and why voters voted for Trump. So it's more political in nature, but it really is a testament to how even more recently we're still being affected by the consequences of deindustrialization. So this is something I've been diving really deeper into. I would love to make hey bud, another video on this or write some essays on it. So if you are interested in diving deeper into this is something I'm really interested in. But my thesis is, I think productivity gains decoupled from wages because we eliminated the mechanism to transfer those productivity gains to workers, that being jobs, and the jobs that have replaced factory work since then. So a lot of white collar work that required a college degree. You were never part of the production process. You were renting your time. You were renting your cognitive capabilities to an employer. You had no part in the productivity process. After this happened, in the 1970s, after we moved to shareholder-based system, a shareholder economic model, productivity gains went to shareholders. And so people who had equity through shares, stock in a company, that's where productivity gains went, not to workers. And so this is why you've seen this consistent decoupling. But I wanted to take some time to break this apart because, again, videos like this are helpful. They're great, but they don't talk about why and what happened. And if you don't understand why and what happened, things are going to continue going as they've always gone, where workers are going to continue struggling. So I think it's really important. All right, let's dive back in.
But most notably, the Volcker recession aligns almost perfectly with when wealth inequality started to rise sharply. This was the period when the wealthiest 1%, and especially those at the very top of that group, began claiming a far greater share of the nation's income. Around the same time, hourly wages stopped keeping pace with productivity gains, and income growth for families in the bottom 80% of the population slowed to a crawl. Yes, these types of massive recessions were much less common before this guy became head of the Federal Reserve. So if you're wondering...
That's also not entirely true. So prior to, he's saying recessions, but prior to the Federal Reserve being created in 1913, there were constant crises. So bank failures, crises. Big one in 1907. That was what laid the precedent for the creation of the Federal Reserve. But you had a lot of economic panics and a lot of problems. So the transition to a managed economy, really the attempt was to prevent the next Great Depression from happening, prevent these recessions from, and these depressions from getting out of control. But they have always, like, there's a cycle. There's cyclical patterns within the economy. These things always happen when wealth inequality gets too big, when the elites are too top heavy and the peasantry and people underneath are struggling and suffering. There's always a crash. There's always problems. Again, I'm a nerd, so I'm actually reading 2 books right now. Secular Cycles by Peter Turchin, and then The Fourth Turning. And both talk about cycles and how history is more cyclical, and really talks about this. But, this stuff happens. So I wouldn't say like, oh, all of a sudden like Paul Volcker came in and, things got worse. Like, things have always been bad. We've just changed how we approach managing the economy.
Wondering why things feel unnecessarily unstable all the time now, or why the wealth inequality gap continues to grow, you can at least partially look at this guy. Of course, this meant that college was affected too. States started cutting higher education funding during recessions, shifting costs to students. The Reagan administration also reduced certain federal grants, like Pell Grants, in real terms. Not to worry though, cause this is when consumer goods started to become affordable. Yeah! Thanks to deregulation, manufacturing of electronics spread overseas, with Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea becoming powerhouses for common useful household items.
Notice he said it spread overseas. Again, this is why the history is important. This was a deliberate choice. Companies and employers across the country were making deliberate choices to offshore American manufacturing jobs overseas. So the reason why consumer goods became affordable is because we offshored the production of them to lower cost centers. And, you know, there's other factors into this as well. There's culture and things like that. But at the economic level, it became cheaper to produce these things. Therefore, it became more accessible for the average person. I would use Henry Ford's Model T as an example. Prior to the Model T, prior to his production process, you know, average people couldn't afford cars. They were too expensive. Then all of a sudden, Henry Ford introduced mass production and production lines into manufacturing, and all of a sudden, you know, things became more affordable. So wherever there are cheaper cost centers, things will become more affordable, more accessible. So I don't want you to think like, oh, magically all of a sudden we became hyper consumerist and then things like changed in price. They changed in price for a reason, and you have to understand why they changed in price to understand how we got to where we are today with surging wealth inequality.
As a result, TV prices saw a 5 to 6% drop per year, and Commodore, a popular computer company in the 80s, slashed the prices of their home computers from $499 to as low as $199 around 1983. And the wide accessibility of home computers was about to change the future of jobs and consumerism forever. The 1990s was a technology boom. Tech hubs in urban areas such as Silicon Valley, Seattle, and Boston's Route 128 corridor became magnets for startups and venture capital. But
again, there's a cost to all of this. I'm not going to get into this in too much detail in this video. I've written a separate essay on a book by an economist named Carlotta Perez. I'll link it in the description and you can read it further. But basically, in the same way that there's cycles within generations and there's cycles within the business cycle, there's also cycles in technological development. So the tech hub of the 90s, like tech industry, didn't just come out of nowhere. Again, I should have included this in my timeline, but in the 1970s, the microprocessor became commercialized. And so for the first time, we had a way to produce computers at scale for individual use. And that's what transformed the job market. And this happened, again, as manufacturing was waning. So you had offshoring of manufacturing jobs at a time when there was an inflection in technology. You saw the emergence of a new technology, computers, personal computing, softwares, all that kind of stuff. And then you saw a new demand for new types of work, so that's white collar work. We're seeing the same thing today. This is why the cyclical nature of this is important. AI has come online. You're going to see a decline in, I would say, like Web 2 based, software, computer-based interfacing. You're going to see a decline in white-collar knowledge work, and you're going to see an incline in folks who know how to work with AI. So these things don't just come out of nowhere. There's a reason for it. And then because of the change, so the change from manufacturing to white-collar work, you saw a rise in college enrollments. Again, that wasn't just because people magically decided, oh, we're going to start going to college. There were changes in culture. So feminism in the 70s as well played a role in this. But changes in technology, policies that were being made, changes in how we saw the economy, that drove more and more people to get credentialed through a college degree, because that was how they could access the new job market that was emerging.
But the demand in urban job growth couldn't keep up with supply. If you wanted to be a part of these growing industries, you had to either pay a premium or get stuck in suburban sprawl and deal with a 1-hour commute to work. As for college, the 1992 reauthorization of the Higher Education Act introduced unsubsidized Stafford loans, available regardless of financial need, and relaxed borrowing limits, expanding access dramatically. This led to an increase in the share of undergrads borrowing Stafford loans, from about 19% in 1992 to 93 to roughly 25% by 1995 to 96. And as a consequence, this is when tuition costs really started to skyrocket. At public four-year institutions, tuition alone increased from around $1,780 in 1989 to about $3,349 in 1999 to 2000, an annual growth rate of approximately 6.5%.
So it's possible that legislation may have influences, but I think it's also possible that, colleges are greedy and they're subsidized by the government, so there's no cost, there's no loss to them. You and I are not paying the college directly. I went to Syracuse University. I did not pay Syracuse University out of my own pocket. The government did. So the government fronted me, and I am now paying the Department of Education back, right? So I think it's possible that legislation did. I wouldn't necessarily equate correlation with causation. I think, like I was saying before, there was a massive structural change in the economy. A college degree became the new requirement if you wanted entry into the more tech-enabled white-collar workforce, rise of professional jobs and that kind of thing. And so you had a huge demand. You had a surge in demand for college enrollment that didn't exist, a generation prior. And I think colleges saw an opportunity, and because, they were being subsidized by government loans, like, why not raise prices? Why not? There's no mechanism in place. And this was something I always wondered when I was a student. Like, every year, the Daily Orange or the campus newspaper would talk about, tuition's going to go up 3% this year, 2% this year, and there's no mechanism to stop it. There was nothing. So I think you see this with government-funded and government-subsidized programs, and so this is where my inner libertarian comes out. I'm like, we need to get out of this stuff. As long as the government continues to, funnel money to this, and there's no cost, there's no consequence for it, they're going to continue to do it. So there's no incentive for colleges and universities to decrease their prices, and as a result, we're seeing prices go up, and in part, that's our fault as consumers. We've enabled this to happen because we continue demanding access to these bullshit college degrees that actually mean nothing.
Total cost of attendance at public four-year schools jumped about 66%, from $4,975 to $8,274 over the decade. If students could simply borrow more, universities had little incentive to keep costs in line with inflation. And behind the scenes, administrative staffing also ballooned, adding layers of student services, marketing departments, and compliance offices.
Oh my gosh, okay, so many books. I didn't bring this one in to highlight it, but Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber, another great book. But he also talks about the evolution of jobs. And so part of the transition we've seen into a more technocratic, expert, white collar workforce is you had to create more jobs, right? You had to create bullshit work to create all these new jobs because the economy didn't have other jobs. There weren't, like, you lost manufacturing. And it's not like we created new jobs. We just created different types of jobs. And the only way to continue employment is to balloon and increase. That's why you see college universities have huge numbers. That's why the government bureaucracy, you have huge numbers. The private sector is accountable to shareholders and is accountable to consumers. So there's checks and balances and mechanisms to keep inflation of jobs numbers in place. When you're publicly funded and subsidized by the government, there's no mechanism in place. So that's another book I would highly recommend reading as well if you're interested about how the knowledge workforce of today has gotten to the point where it is. It's interesting.
Costs that were ultimately passed on to students. Tuition rose at more than double the rate of inflation for much of the decade, and this new culture of borrowing meant students often didn't feel the pain until years after graduation, when loan repayments came due. This is a culture that still persists today, of course, which is why all these statistics are relevant, but consumer goods went down again. Yes! Once the economic reforms in China took hold fully during the 1990s, foreign firms began relocating production to China, ramping up production while reducing costs.
Okay, so what happened here, again, this is why context and history is so important. China basically cheated their way through global trade for like a decade or two. After Deng Xiaoping came in and took over after Mao. I think it was after Mao. But again, 1970s. 1970s is such an important decade, and we don't talk about it enough. Changed China's economic policy, tried to open the door to more trade internationally. For the longest time, the United States was annually certifying trade agreements bilaterally with China, and then We gave, I think it was 19, hold on, let me look. When did China? So in 2001, China entered the World Trade Organization, and basically that gave them access to the entire global economy. They could start trading with anyone and everyone with preferred status, and so lower tariffs and that kind of thing. And so all of a sudden, China became the viable option for producing cheap consumer goods. So again, it's not an accident that all of a sudden you see an acceleration of deindustrialization in the 2000s as well. Again, these two books I talk about, American Made and Janesville. While I think actually both these they moved to Mexico, but they highlight how easy it was for companies to relocate, and so cheap consumer goods, so apparel, so clothing, toys, electronics, all that kind of stuff, was largely shipped over to China, in part because they had access. So again, China didn't just magically China just magically appear out of nowhere as a producer of cheap consumer goods. There were deliberate policies in place and strategies implemented to make it so that they could be a beneficiary of that.
Once the economic reforms in China took hold fully during the 1990s,
so
foreign firms began relocating
se.
production to China, ramping up production while reducing costs. But wait, Cole, why are we only talking about TVs and computers? That's not all that Gen Z is buying in order to be in luxury poverty. Well, you're right, but it's these pieces of technology that change the way consumers buy goods, like matcha and Labubus, and what the culture centered around forever. By the time the 2000s rolled around, the high cost of housing, tuition, and debt was solidifying its place in America for good. And just in time for one of the worst recessions in history, the 2008 housing bubble. After the dot-com crash and 9/11, the Federal Reserve cut interest rates to historic lows, from 6.5% in 2000 to 1% by 2003. This made borrowing incredibly cheap, encouraging people to take on bigger mortgages and pushing home prices higher.
Again, I appreciate videos like this, but there's just not enough historical context in all of this, and I think he's drawing some wrong conclusions. It's not just okay, you had a 1% interest rate, therefore people just started buying homes. There was some predatory stuff happening. Go watch The Big Short if you want to see how this played out. But new financial products were being created on Wall Street, and there was an incentive to sell these products to subprime borrowers within the United States. So people who didn't have the incomes to support the types of homes they were buying. So you had people, say, okay, for example, even if you're Gen Z or not, just pretend you want to go buy a house. What your income is. Let's say you make $50,000 a year. Okay, let's say you get pre-qualified by the bank to go buy a house that's $700,000, right? You can't afford that. Any logical person would know that is way out of how much, your price capacity. You can't afford that. But banks will pre-qualify you because they want to sell you a higher loan, because that's how they make money. They make money off the interest rates on the debt they give you. So what was happening is you had all these mortgage companies, some by banks, some just independent, who were offering mortgages to subprime borrowers who couldn't afford, the loans, but when you're told, oh, it's, this is your dream house, what's an extra 100,000, if you don't have boundaries, firm financial boundaries on what you can afford and what you can't, you're going to get seduced into buying something and financing it when you can't afford it. And this is exactly what's happening with Gen Z right now, right? Buying into this idea of luxury poverty, and then, oh, I'll just buy now, pay later, right? This is exactly what's happening. But if you really want to understand the financial crisis and the incentive structure of the financial crisis, it wasn't just, middle-class Americans who are like, oh my gosh, it's a 1% interest rate. Let me go buy a house that I can't afford now. No, there was a lot of stuff happening, specifically on Wall Street, that incentivized and very predatory. It was very predatory. That sold Americans loans that they could not afford.
Basically, a lot of people who shouldn't have been allowed mortgages got mortgages they couldn't pay back, and everyone invested in this scheme was doing something shady, which caused the bubble to burst and a bunch of people to go bankrupt. Go watch The Big Short if you want a better explanation.
Great movie.
All you need to know is that it was the worst economic downturn since the 1930s, and as a result, housing development dramatically plummeted, making it even more unaffordable. And you already know what was going on in college by now. College tuition outpaced inflation every year, and student debt doubled from 2000 to 2010. At the same time, a lot of for-profit colleges were...
So what he's not talking about here is the impact that this had on jobs and the role of jobs. All I think underpinning all of this and why you're seeing certain things happen in history and in the economy is whether or not there are jobs. So during the financial crisis, there was a significant loss of jobs. And this was happening as deindustrialization was happening. So keep in mind that factories weren't just, didn't just stop moving overseas. Factories were continuing to outsource American jobs overseas. And then you had a pullback in the economy. And whenever there's a recession, employers will tend to pull back. So you had all these people who did not have jobs, who needed jobs. So for my generation, millennials, we took refuge in college. I graduated high school in 2009, graduated college in 2013. So I'm kind of on the middle younger end of the millennial generation. But you had kids who were supposed to enter the job market in 2008 or had just entered it. They were still young and fresh in their careers, got laid off. You had folks who were graduating college when I was graduating high school, and so they just kind of rolled everything over, went into get their JDs or a master's degree, and then folks like me went in and we just like hunkered down in college. So yeah, college debt increased and the cost of tuition increased, but there weren't alternatives in the economy, or at least people weren't aware of alternatives where they existed. It was just kind of this push, okay, there's no jobs, go to college. And that's what a lot of people did during this time.
Expanding aggressively. Another notable trend that signaled the new culture of college. But flat screen TVs became mainstream. Let's go! China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, exploding globalization, slashing manufacturing costs, and paving the way for random cheap products nobody needs. Love it. Now let's lump the 2010s and 2020s together to speed up the main points, because by now in the video, you kind of get a gist of where this is going. After 2008, housing construction lagged badly. Developers were cautious, zoning was still restrictive, and demand was picking up, driving up prices. Big investors, both in the 2010s and up to present-day 2020s, began buying single-family homes to rent, and more unaffordable luxury apartments were being built, pushing prices up even further. State funding for college hit multi-decade lows, student debt kept getting worse, but now we have unlimited access to any single product we could ever want with 2-day shipping. Yay! Do you get it now? Do you understand why Gen Z is living in luxury poverty? It's not like all of Gen Z is out of a job. Yes, they're dealing with one of the worst job markets that seems to be getting worse the more we understand it, but a lot of them do have disposable income. It's just that they're living in a system that makes it nearly impossible for them to afford a house despite having a job, because wages have not kept up with inflation or house prices, and college debt keeps them from justifying as big of a purchase as college.
No. Okay, I want to push back on this because I bought into this, and some of the early work I published online, I talked about this, and I'm changing course on this. College debt is only expensive if you choose to go to college. You don't need to go to college. It was peddled to all of us. We were all told to go to college, and it was a flat out lie. There are all sorts of different professions you can enter without a college degree. Trade school is making a comeback, and I think that's really important. Plumbers. There's a shortage of plumbers. Jeffrey Hinton, the godfather of AI, says, people should go be plumbers. And he's not wrong. We have stopped working. We've taken on all these made up jobs in the knowledge sector, doing bullshit work, responding to emails, going to meetings, and we call that, professional employment. When the economy really can't justify that kind of work anymore. Meanwhile, there's not enough plumbers to go around. There's not enough welders, right? There's a shortage of all sorts of different types of tradesmen in the economy. And those people can command huge salaries because there's such a short supply. Like if you live, let me give you an example. When I lived in Washington, D.C., I regrettably had an Audi. So I would take my car to get maintenance done at a, body shop that specialized in working on Audis. And all the mechanics there made six figures. And I was just like, how on earth are mechanics making so much money in Washington, D.C.? And it had never dawned on me. It's because there were so many people like me who had dumb, stupid cars that needed maintenance all the time. People like me couldn't fix our own cars, so I had to go to body shops like this and pay whatever they charged to fix the car. And because you had so many people in DC, for example, that owned Mercedes and had Audis and had luxury cars, they could charge that, right? And so it depends on the market. Whereas, there's so many lawyers in DC, I know lawyers that were working for $35 an hour because they couldn't get actual work as a lawyer because there's an oversupply of lawyers. So you have to use your brain a little bit. You have to, and this is where economics is so important, supply and demand. If there is an oversupply of laborers, of skilled laborers with bachelor's degrees, the price and wages is going to go down. If there's an undersupply or an insufficient supply of plumbers and there's a constant demand for plumbing, their wages are going to go up because they can charge more, right? So you don't need to go to college. And if you're Gen Z watching this, I would suggest dropping out. I think it's absolutely useless. You have 2 generations worth of employees, Gen X and Millennials, who can attest that there has not been the return on the college investment we were all promised. And so you're not going to fare better, especially now that AI is coming online. You are doomed if you're still in college and you're taking on debt and you know this. You're watching this, you're paying attention to this. This information is here and you're still in college. That's on you. And so there's that piece of it. But then there's also the myth of housing prices. And yes, housing is expensive. I understand that. It's unaffordable for a lot of people. However, it's not unaffordable everywhere. I come from a Rust Belt town, like I said, upstate New York. Personally, I don't want to live in upstate New York, but it's a beautiful place and there's a lot of affordable housing. That's because people like me grew up and moved away. Right? And the people who stayed, they're getting old. They can't afford to, maintain their homes. There's not enough jobs. So these people are, for that type of work, so people are leaving. So there's all sorts of reasons why, different towns and cities and all across America, right, have been depopulated and there's a lower cost of living there. So you can go to Columbus, Detroit, small towns in upstate New York, Pennsylvania, Indiana, even here in Texas, small towns here in Texas. There is an abundance of affordable housing. People just have to choose to want to live there. My parents' house in, their neighbor's house is for sale right now. I think it's $200,000. Nice home, corner lot, good school district, like a safe neighborhood, 5-6 hour drive to New York City. So if you wanted to go to New York City, you could, college town, not too far away. There's an airport. So there's at least that. There's affordable housing, but you have to choose to want to live there. So personally, if it were me, if I were in my 20s and I were living, say, or working in New York City, I would be moving upstate. I would negotiate a deal. If you can't work full-time remote, if you had to be hybrid in your office in Manhattan for a couple days a week, I would do back-to-back days, find a friend with a couch, sleep on a couch for a night, and I would buy a home upstate, It's not that hard. It's a pain for a little while, sure. But if you can earn an income, a city urban income from a white collar job, whether it's remote or hybrid or whatever, if you can earn that good income and buy a house in somewhere that's a little bit further away, it's an option. But people aren't considering this, West Virginia, not that far from DC. If you had to work in DC, again, if you can negotiate 2 days a week, find someone's couch to sleep on, go buy a house in West Virginia. There are so many options. And if you're fully remote, then you have the picking. You can literally, anywhere with an internet connection, and thanks to Starlink, anywhere can have an internet connection. You can literally live anywhere. So if I were Gen Z right now, I would be looking for lower cost centers. I would be geographically arbitraging. I wouldn't be complaining about the cost of rent rising and cost of home unaffordability. You're not going to buy a home in Nashville. You're not going to buy a home, in Washington, D.C., probably not in the nice parts of Philadelphia, any major city, right? Like Los Angeles, San Francisco, you're not going to buy a home there. And other high demand places, you're also not going to buy a home. So look where there's nice places to live and there's still affordable housing. Maybe you don't want to live in Detroit, but guess what? Detroit has a lot of affordable housing. So I think Gen Z, millennials too. But I think Gen Z needs to read the room, acknowledge college was a lie. You're not going to get the ROI you want. You're better off learning a trade. But if you are in college and you do have a college degree and you are struggling, go learn AI. Figure out how to arbitrage yourself, get remote or hybrid work, and then live in further proximity. So not, Westchester. You're not going to you're priced out of there. Go, 4 or 5 hours up, and then commute and figure out, make it work. But you can buy you can buy houses for $200,000 in this country. And then if you have an FHA loan and you go and you live in an underserved and under an economically depressed area, there's a ton of government loans and funding to support you. So you can get an FHA loan, put 3% down. So whatever 3% on a $200,000 house is, a lot more affordable than, 20% on a $1 million house. So I think Gen Z needs to make choices, and that's part of growing up, is making a choice and being accountable for your actions. But I'm kind of tired of hearing this trope that young people are victims of circumstance. I think there's more options than people realize.
Now, the reason I highlighted housing and college costs specifically alongside consumer goods is because these are the two things I believe that really mark a teenager's progression into adulthood. When you go to college, this is when you're experiencing the world for the first time on your own. It's when you learn to take care of yourself and your space without...
No, college is daycare. College is subsidized, glorified daycare. You get to party all the time. You get study abroad opportunities. You have no responsibility. Hardly anyone works anymore. I think some people, a good number of students probably still do, but a lot of students don't. They're just, joining campus clubs. They're letting their student loans This was my problem, and I'm guilty of it, right? Okay, I didn't know how student loans worked. I didn't understand. I didn't have a first generation, right? I didn't know what to do. I didn't know my student loans, the refund I got from the bursar's office was really how I was financing my life. And so a lot of what happened was lifestyle inflation, and I didn't even realize it was happening. So no, you don't. If you are subsidized, if you're not earning your own money, and if you're not responsible for yourself and your actions, if you're living coddled on an American campus, I'm sorry, but you are not growing up. You are just delaying adulthood.
Without any external help. It's when you have to force yourself to make friends instead of relying on the bonds built through proximity in middle and high school. And that certainly helps to make a person feel like their life is moving forward and that they're maturing. Housing works in the same way. You don't necessarily have to buy a whole ass house to feel like you're moving forward, but when it's clear that the barrier to entry for any housing, whether that be single family homes or huge luxury apartments, is higher than ever, well, naturally, you're going to try to find a way to cope with that. A way that allows you to spend the money you do have on quick dopamine hits while still ensuring you don't take on mountains of debt, although still people do take on mountains of debt for the stupidest shit. And what's the best, cheapest way to do that now? Consumer goods. Cheap electronics, Stanley cups with a weird-ass snack accessory around the rim, Labubu dolls, absurdly overpriced drinks, Steam sales on games you'll play for 60 minutes then never touch again. These are small, reasonably priced items Gen Z can justify buying over going into debt for college or housing. This is why, on the surface, it can seem like Gen Z has enough money. They can afford those iPhones and fashion clothes, older people might say, and if they can afford those, then eventually they can afford housing and college. While spending money on shit you don't need to impress people you don't like is a big problem, even if Gen Z didn't do that, they didn't spend any of their money and they just saved all of it, it would still take them a significantly longer time to purchase the things that make you feel like you're progressing in life. Boomers needed roughly 3.7 years of being at the median annual income to afford a median home price, while Gen Z needs roughly double that. Now you might say, alright Cole, that doesn't seem too bad, it's just a few years difference. But that also assumes they could save 100% of their income, which is obviously unrealistic, especially with all the things necessary for living, like food, college, and medical care, increasing far above the average inflation. So realistically, if we take that into account, it's even more than double the amount of time that it took boomers. And you're still wondering why Gen Z is obsessed with buying random shit? Listen, I understand that some of the responsibility is on the consumer themselves. If you're buying designer clothes or financing burritos or buying a bunch of obscure, cheap household gadgets off Amazon that you don't really have the money for, that is on you. But you have to look deeper than that. You have to ask, why would Gen Z even feel compelled to spend money on these sorts of things? And you can start answering that question as far back as the 1970s, as I showed. Yes, some of this is personal responsibility, but a lot of it is circumstantial. Gen Z grew up during one of the worst recessions that is still affecting them today. They're dealing with the transformation of college culture from one of public necessity to private paywalls. And naturally, when you aren't old enough to understand how to cope with that, or the unprecedented rate of technological growth, especially if you don't have good parental figures, you're gonna turn to temporary pleasures in the form of consumerism. It is the illusion of wealth hiding under an increasingly unstable, uncertain future. And I really do empathize with a lot of these late teenagers and early 20-year-olds who feel like no matter what they do, they will never be able to afford the things that help them mature. The thing is, I can't really tell you with certainty what the fix is. Do we just need to keep building more houses to drive prices down, push the government to instill more state funding for colleges again, vote for the right people who understand how screwed over the youth is getting and want to do something about it? Yes, I'm sure those things can absolutely help, but it's going to take a long time of fighting back and raising awareness around this shit. I just can't leave this video on a bad note. I can't leave you hopeless because it's just not. Things are working against our generation, yes, perhaps more than any previous generation growing up in the past few decades. But just because it will take longer to see progress and make changes doesn't mean that it's never going to happen. Currently, a lot of you are reacting to the world in the way any kid would when faced with an unknown future job market, stupidly high housing prices, and terrible cost of education. And I get that, but as much as this is gonna sound like a dude is just telling you to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which I'm not saying is the only option, there are ways out. There's nothing wrong with living with your parents for a longer time than past generations in order to save money. There's nothing wrong with struggling to find a job in this market. What matters is that your actions are aligned with the person you want to become, even if those actions aren't producing the results you want yet. I'm not even saying the results you want are guaranteed if you start aligning your actions with the person who makes progress in life, but it's a hell of a lot better than spending the rest of your days purchasing unnecessary pleasures that won't lead to lasting fulfillment. You don't need to reach these societal standards we've constructed, like graduating by this age or having a house or a wife or a husband by this age. But you should want to do things with your time that genuinely excite you, that lead to you building your mental and physical fortitude. Join free clubs, get involved with volunteer work, go to a library and read a genre you've never read before, study an up-and-coming industry, start a personal project, gain relevant skills you enjoy. Whatever takes you farther away from the endless, dreadful hamster wheel of consumerism and closer to the version of you that realizes that life has a lot more possibilities than you initially thought, fucking do that shit. Other than raising awareness or trying to make changes on a local level, there's not much else you can do. So go do that stuff. If you liked this video, you might...
All right, I like how he ended it. Just kind of encouraging, young people to just go and do things and not get hung up on the costs. But I will say, and I will double down on this, like, Gen Z needs to make a decision. And I know it's just easy just to do what everyone tells you to do what everyone around you is doing, but you need to make a decision. So the first thing, turn off your phones, get off social media, because that is poison. It's poisoning your mind. It's creating an illusion of a world that doesn't exist. And then you feel like you need to spend money. Like Labubu, I had no idea what Labubu was, but I've seen people on YouTube talk about it. No idea. It means nothing. It's probably some cheap Chinese made thing, right? However you learned about it, Stanley Cups, great example. Stanley Cups went viral on social media, and then all of a sudden, everyone and their brother seemed to need to have a Stanley Cup. You had 13-year-olds getting bullied in school for not having Stanley Cups. Delete social media. It's not doing you any good, and it's just sucking you deeper into the consumer rabbit hole. From there, figure out what is, not what ought to be, and get rid of all assumptions of what you think the world ought to be, right? Like, you are a fresh generation. You get to create your own milestones and things that you think are important and things that you value. Stop pegging your success against boomers. They lived in a different world, a different economic environment, a different social context, okay? They are not you, and you do not need to judge yourself against them. Come up with something new for yourselves and go pursue it. Don't ascribe any sort of timeline to it. Just go do it. I think starting families is important. Having a job and a vocation, something you care passionately about, is important. I think having hobbies is important. Don't put a timeline on it. Just go and work towards those things, and eventually your work will pay off and it'll happen. But you need to make decisions. You need to look at the writing on the wall, read the room, and say, okay, There is no return on this college investment. What am I doing? Get out now, drop out. Okay. Look at the job market. Be like, okay, new jobs aren't being created. I've written other pieces on this and I'll share my Substack in the description if you want to read more, but the economy has not been adding white collar professional jobs for years. So if you studied marketing, if you studied business, if you studied finance, whatever you studied in college, the job you expect to have hasn't been created and is not being created. So you need to find something else. You need to look for where jobs are being created. I talked about blue collar trades. That's an option. But there's also AI jobs and becoming more AI literate. I'm working on a book right now about this, and I think it's really important. You need to become AI literate. So you're not going to get that AI literacy in college. I'll tell you that right now. That's another reason why you should drop out. And then geo arbitrage. Like, yeah, okay, you're not going to get to live in the city. That's cool. But again, what's the point of living in cities? This is something I've started to think about now that I'm in a different season of life. I'm in, entering my mid 30s. Cities are consumer sucks, right? What is the benefit of living close to a Sweetgreen? Like, you don't need Sweetgreen. Yeah, you can go, making a salad is easy, right? You don't need to spend $15-$20 on Sweetgreen. You don't need to spend $15-$20 on a Chipotle burrito. You can learn how to make all that yourself, and it's far more economical to do so, right? So start thinking about, like, what's the benefit of cities that provide entertainment, okay, expensive entertainment, bars, going out, paying overpriced amounts of money for drinks, fast food, fast casual food, subpar restaurants, housing, like he said, luxury apartments that you didn't ask for, that you don't want, and then you can't afford. Like, who put that there, right? Shopping centers. What do you do for fun? Okay, what do most people do for fun? They go shopping, right? So consider living outside of a city. Cities don't offer much benefit. Yeah, okay. Some cities, there's caveats. When I lived in DC, there was a ton of the Smithsonian museums, free museums. Okay, fine. Live close to a city. Live within like an hour or two from a city. You don't need to live downtown city proper, as someone who has done that. There's just, it's not giving you what you think it's going to give you. So consider relocating. If you have a flexible work schedule, or you have hybrid work, or you have remote work, take your income and go live somewhere cheaper. There's a lot of cheap places in this country that are not being talked about because they're not sexy places to live in, okay? If you can't afford to live in Manhattan, don't live in Manhattan. If you can't afford to live in Brooklyn, don't live in Brooklyn. If you can afford to live in, a rural town in Pennsylvania or New Jersey that's within an hour of I-95 or is close to a train station you can Amtrak in, better. Do that, okay? So make better choices. I think I get the frustration. I get what he's saying here. I understand. Like I said before, Gen Z isn't exceptional. Millennials went through the same thing when we were in our 20s, suffering some of the same problems. And it's only going to get worse from here. So I think the faster that Gen Z wakes up and understands what's happening, the better off y'all will be. I would be curious to know, regardless of what, age group and generation you identify with. I'd be curious to know, like, your thoughts on this idea of luxury poverty. I really do think this is a choice, and I say this as someone who made those choices in my 20s and would have wagged my finger at, older Amanda today. But with age comes wisdom. So I think it's a misnomer, and you just have to make better choices and delay gratification. Get off your phones. Stop being victims of circumstance, stop using social media, and start taking more ownership over your lives. And I think the more you do that, the more success you'll see. But I would be curious to know what you think. Feel free to leave a comment in the description if you like this video. I would love it if you would subscribe. That would help me out as I build this channel. And I'll see you in the next one.